I'm Paddy O'Connell, I'm chairing. We do run it as a public meeting. We find that you in the audience often know as much as people on the panel, and we look forward to you catching our eye so that it's run like that. We do begin on time, i.e. 7, and end at 8:25, so busy people can get to where they've got to go. Just a quick example about Irina, who's sitting on my left. Russian pessimism announced to me a few months ago, there's no one here. And then the room filled up. I said, that's British optimism, for which we're not known. So without any further ado, the topic that's brought you all here is the war on terror. Are Russia and the West now on the same side? And we're going to divide the evening into two halves. Firstly, the Russian question, and then a more general go-round about the war on terror. But to introduce themselves, I'd like to ask Irina Demchenko, UK Bureau Chief of the Russian news agency RIA Novosti, to go first with a little biography of yourself. Nothing too long.
No, it's not a long biography. So my name is Irina Demchenko. I was born in Moscow. I'm Russian. I'm a professional journalist. I worked in the major Soviet and then Russian newspapers, in Izvestia for 6 years, in the Moscow Times, in its best time, and in the Moscow News. I was invited by Reuters to be a Russian service editor when they launched it in 1994. I was the first Russian service editor. I worked with Reuters in Moscow for nearly 9 years. And then I resigned, and then I became a deputy editor-in-chief of RIA Novosti news agency, which is a state-owned news agency in Moscow, and was responsible for all editorial operations globally. And after 3 years, I moved here as a London bureau chief for RIA Novosti news agency, and I'm here for about 4 years.
And living in London, does anything living in Russia prepare you for living in London?
No.
Right. And Dr.
I mean, even despite that I traveled here lots on the business trips.
No will do.
No.
We haven't got long. And Dr. Bobo Lo is Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for European Reform.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, I've led something of a checkered career, doing various jobs over the last 10 years. I've been director of the Russia and China programs at the Centre for European Reform. Before that, I was the head of the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And before that, I was the #2 at the Australian Embassy in Moscow. I specialize generally in Russian foreign and security policy, but obviously I have to cover quite a lot of Russian domestic politics. I've written various books generally on Russian foreign policy. The most recent one being Axis of Convenience, Moscow, Beijing, and the New Geopolitics, which came out in late 2008 on the Sino-Russian relationship.
Thank you. And on your left is Masha Karp, a freelance commentator on rights in Russia.
Right. I came to Britain from Petersburg in 1991, and I have been working for the Russian service of the BBC for 18 years. I've been features editor for 13 years. In 2009, features department in the Russian service was closed because the BBC thought that too analytical and too serious programs is probably too much for the audience, and they stayed just with the news. So I had to leave the BBC, and I'm now a freelance journalist, mostly interested in relations of Russia and the West. And recently I've been working on a newly founded website called Rights in Russia, and you will be able to see its address on the leaflets that are behind your backs. And that's basically what I've been doing.
The last 20 years of your life. Thank you very much. That's Oksana, and Oksana Antonenko will join us in about 10 minutes or so. Oh, I said 10 minutes, you're very early on. As you're walking in, having your microphone pulled on, I'll say that you're Senior Fellow and Programme Director at the International Institute for Strategic Studies.
Thank you. So
And would you kindly give us a brief 30 seconds on your life so far?
just came from the CNN studio, so don't think that I wear my makeup like this all the time.
Well, I'm sure we do go on. Tell us what one of your areas of specialty is at the Institute for Strategic Studies.
Well, I'm a senior fellow and I'm program director for Russia Eurasia, so I cover Central Asia, Caucasus, Russia, and looking at the Russia's security policy as well as the challenges Russia is facing in North Caucasus and generally terrorism and defense issues.
Thank you. So that's our panel tonight. So I thought I'd begin by showing a brief clip because everyone around the world, the TV viewing public, understands what terrorism is. They normally react to bombings in the cities of the world, especially on the subways. We've seen it here. And our question tonight is to ask, are there any similarities other than just what the TV news would say? And here is a clip to remind us of the fact that at least 40 people lost their lives. This is ABC from the United States.
It takes 4 minutes to reach from the streets. Russia Today reporter Yulia Shapovalova heard one of the explosions and ran to the station just seconds after the blast. Here's what she saw.
I heard the blast itself at the Park Kulturi station. People were very nervous. They were moving around. They didn't know where to go. I personally saw a young woman covered with blood, and another was so scared, so she was crying. The third one was talking to someone by her telephone, by her mobile phone, thanking God for her survival. And after all that, I started realizing that I had survived myself, so I consider myself very lucky indeed. While I was there underground, the authorities probably had known about the first blast. So actually they urgently evacuated people, but still we know that there are some victims of the second blast. I saw the very first victim who was helped by other people to they assisted her to get into an emergency car. So, but I'm still very, very nervous. I'm really sorry about that. But now I feel like a participant of the whole thing. But it's a big tragedy, I should say.
An eyewitness account from Moscow. Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has vowed to destroy those responsible for the attacks. And President Obama has just weighed in with a statement as well. He says the American people stand united with the people of Russia.
Right, and that's the last point. You know what he was going to say. They're shoulder to shoulder, and it's all the same. Irina Demchenko, what does this dreadful murder on the subway in Moscow tell us about terror in Russia?
This Park Kultura station is 5 minutes walk from our headquarters, where our agency is located. And it was a rush hour, a morning rush hour, so many of my colleagues were either on this train or on the train which arrived opposite from another direction at this exactly minute. And I remember the huge scared wave of an agency that we have lost somebody of our colleagues. They luckily all survived, even those who were on the same train. I mean, it means that nobody in the world is protected. Not even in Moscow. Everybody is under the threat.
And Dr. Bobo Lo, is it the same threat, or is it a different threat in different countries?
I think it's very much a different kind of threat. Of course, there are some human commonalities, innocent victims, tragedy. Clearly, that's universal. That aspect is. But I see very much the problem of terrorism in the North Caucasus as fundamentally a domestic problem with primarily domestic causes and ultimately domestic solutions. I mean, ask ourselves, how did we get to this point? And I think there are any number of factors, and I'll just quickly go through a few. There's a long time, a historical tradition of revolt, going back to the middle of the 19th century. There's a general sense of feeling of alienation. Partly this is self-alienation, but it's also a feeling that Russia has alienated the Caucasus and that people in the Caucasus are not welcome in Russia proper, so to speak. There is the brutality of the federal security services and the widespread abuse of human rights in the North Caucasus. There are clearly some bad personnel choices that Moscow has made over recent years, the obvious ones being the appointment of Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya, and then the replacement of Ausha by Zyazikov in Ingushetia. There are catastrophic levels of corruption in the North Caucasus. There are minimal socio-economic prospects in the North Caucasus, particularly for the 16 to 30 generation, where people talk about generally a 75% unemployment. Of course, there is foreign involvement. There's men, weapons, financing, logistical support, and it certainly hasn't helped. But I regard the foreign element as essentially peripheral. There is, of course, an ideological and religious messianic element, but again, this is a relatively small component of the overall North Caucasus problem. And finally, why do you have these bombings taking place in Moscow at this time? You can argue, in a sense, in a sort of paradoxical way, that the security services have managed to press the resistance and the terrorists so far that they feel that the only course of action that they have is to bomb Moscow, because that's the only way they can actually feel that they're still in the game, so to speak, still in the fight, still in the struggle. None of this is to justify what has happened, but I do wish to emphasize that the causes of this conflict and the causes of the bombing that we're talking about are fundamentally domestic, overwhelmingly so, although, of course, there are some foreign elements involved.
So that's early on an answer to the question, are we on the same side? You're saying Russia and the West are on different sides with different conflicts.
It's not so much that if you say different sides, if you say opposing sides, that's not what I want to say. But terrorism in the West, or as experienced by the West, is very, very different from a terrorism that's based in Moscow and in North Caucasus.
Masha Karp.
Yeah, I agree with Bobo Lo on that. What I wanted to add, I think it's not useful to say that Russia and the West are facing the common enemy. I think it's really dangerous, because when after 9/11 attacks, Putin said that he would support the coalition fighting the international terrorism, just let the coalition support him in his fight in Chechnya. That was the moment when the West actually turned a blind eye to all the brutality of the state terrorism in Russia. And what we've received is the transformation of the Chechen separatism, which was the issue then in the First War and even at the beginning of the Second War, into the issues of religious of radical Islam or whatever. But I completely agree that the issues are domestic, and foreign elements, if they are there, they are of peripheral sense. I can very quickly just name the issues, we'll probably talk about it later, which differ very much Russia from the West in the response to that. Because, first of all, in Russia, the value of human life, of course, is completely different, so the response is different. Then, secondly, Russia is, as everybody accepts, and even the president accepts today, is not a law-based society. So also what the law enforcement bodies are doing is completely different, obviously. Nobody really trusts them. And even the president and the prime minister are talking about destroying terrorists, not bringing them to justice. This is in the country which actually doesn't have the capital punishment. And some Medvedev even said that some of the terrorists who blew up the train in November have already been destroyed, whatever that means. So he sees the situation as the war rather than a terrorist attack. But what else is important, that because of all this bunch of lies that comes very often from Russian media and from Russian governmental sources, lots of people, much more than in America or in Britain, suspect special services in collaboration with terrorists. Some people think that these are terrorists who use the corruption of special services. Some people think that special services just use the terrorists to achieve their own aims. It can be argued about.
Probably will be. And then after this intervention, we'll come to the floor if you wish. But Oksana Antonenko, I think we can all hear a distinction here between domestic and something with a religious flavour.
I disagree with that. I certainly disagree with that. I think if we look at the conflict in Chechnya, you know, at the beginning of the war in '96, during the Yeltsin's time and during the first war, certainly was a different kind of conflict. But today Russia is facing very much similar type of the terrorist threats that the West is facing. I think we have a terrorist threats in this country which generate from the domestically UK-grown groups that actually grew up here, who, you know, bomb the buses here or the metro bombings. We have the Basque terrorists in France and in Spain, who also perpetrate, of course, you know, the terrorist campaign and kill a lot of law enforcement agencies, and in some cases indiscriminate terrorism. I think the suicide bombings, which we have seen, particularly suicide bombing committed by, you know, is now being suspected, not by some marginal, you know, this deprived, as Bobo said, you know, unemployed people, but actually, you know, by more, you know, educated, you know, people who actually have been brought into that radicalization and the terrorism by cynical groups that you want to use the suicide bombing as the weapon for indiscriminate killing. And I think this is the threat which many people in the West are now facing, and this is this homegrown, you know, radical groups. And of course, in each country, the causes are completely different. And of course, I agree completely that the Russian authorities are not dealing with the problem fairly and well. But the challenges are similar, and we all are failing with dealing with those challenges.
Yeah, I would agree with Oksana completely. I think she's absolutely right, because all these events show that we're in the same situation, and they probably unite us more than anything else, because all our civilians are unprotected, and all the authorities now will think of what to do with these cases around the world.
I've cut you off short twice. Our other panellists have had slightly more time. I suppose we're all here to ask if there's anything going on with bombers who are suicide bombers on the Moscow subway. Can it really have anything to do with us here? There's an awful lot of talk galvanizing our troops going off here, billions being spent on wars. Is it really fair for you to tell an audience in London that Moscow suicide bombers are the same as the British-based Islamists and all the militant problems that are seen in Afghanistan and Pakistan and 9/11? Should we not be honest about it? There's a difference.
I don't see a big difference.
Bobo.
Look, I think it's important to understand context here. Oksana makes a fair point that the actual bombers are more educated. They're not the sort of unemployed youth that you have in North Caucasus. That's certainly true. But there is a difference here. You have to ask yourself, would you have these kind of incidents if you didn't have 75% unemployment, if you didn't have routine brutality and widespread abuse of human rights in the North Caucasus, if you didn't have an uneducated population, if you didn't have rampant corruption? Would you have the context that would enable, that would provide essentially the support for such incidents to take place? I would argue that those incidents, while they might not be excluded entirely, are far less likely to happen in a much more, if you like,
in London or Paris,
or Madrid.
Yes, but I mean, look at you have one incident in London. You have one incident. Now,
how many did you have in Moscow?
You've had many incidents in Moscow. My
Lots
God.
of them.
Yeah, okay, let's start. Do you want to count
in the
them
last
off?
5 years, we didn't have.
Well, since 2004, but before that, there were more than a dozen
Many
altogether.
incidents.
I mean,
far greater.
How many
frequency.
incidents did we have
But
in
also,
Paris?
I mean, let's not forget that what also happened in North Caucasus. Again, this is a problem that when we take a Moscow-centered view, you think, oh, it's only the North Caucasus. Who cares? So long as it happens in the North Caucasus, we don't care. It doesn't affect us.
Masha Karp.
But these incidents are absolutely routine all throughout the North Caucasus and quite frequent in Moscow as well over the last decade. I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is information, there is data from the official sources that in 2009, in the 11 months of 2009, there were 786 terrorist attacks either happening or prevented. That's the official data. That means 2 a day. And that is basically in the south of Russia, people just don't pay attention to what's happening there. So Moscow is much more in everybody's view, but this is still Russia. Yeah. Also, just one thing about the education. In Russia, because of the lies, we don't know really well who is doing what, because one of the suspected shaheeds, so to speak, she seemed to have had 2 degrees, about education. But she also, there is this discrepancies in the fact how she got to Moscow. So we can't believe a single word of information from the official sources, I'm afraid.
I'm coming to the audience in just a second. And Oksana Antonenko, would you contribute to this lively discussion, this difference? It comes down to...
No, I totally agree. If we look at the situation in the North Caucasus, it's of course different, because in the North Caucasus we do have not an issue of terrorism, we have an issue of ongoing conflict which is not resolved, and most of the attacks, are directed not against the innocent civilians. Some of them are, like Beslan, for example, hostage siege. I've been there a few days after the siege. It's still left for me, the memory which I will never ever forget in my life, to just walk through that school and see the walls covered with the blood of children, totally innocent children who were there, not fighting this war, just went to school on the 1st of September wanting to. I still, when I talk about it, I still feel that. And there is, of course, innocent, but most of those 200 episodes or 300 episodes last year are directed against law enforcement officials. They are being killed and targeted, and they are brutal and they're terrible. But what happened in Moscow is different. In Moscow, it is a deliberate act of suicide bombing perpetrated by people who conspired to kill innocent people indiscriminately and who do not even put any demands. This is just a killing for the killing's sake, and I think this is the problem that we are facing. And this is not only Russia, and many countries in the world are now facing, but we don't know what to do with it, because we are really powerless in dealing with those people.
We've got a room full of opinions, so obviously, let's go to one. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Ray Furlong, BBC, so I knew you, Paddy. I don't know if this is working, but anyway. What I'd like to say is, I suppose, a couple of things. One is, it seems to me there's a fairly clear and fundamental difference between bombs in London, Madrid, attacks in New York on one side and the attacks in Moscow on the other. And that is that those attacks are the result of Western foreign policy, whereas this is basically a Russian domestic issue. It's Russia fighting a war within its own borders. So you've got 2 completely separate wars, if you can call them wars, conflicts going on. The second thing I'd like to say is really a question. It relates to the violence and the brutality of the Russian security forces in the North Caucasus, which has been spoken about a bit. A lot of that obviously goes on in Chechnya, and I'm just interested in your views in terms of how much control the Kremlin actually exerts over Chechnya. To what extent Kadyrov is in fact independent in all but name?
Irina?
Answering your second question, we have been to Chechnya with Oksana less than a year ago, less than 2 years ago. We have spoken to Kadyrov. If you ask me how much they control Kadyrov, he is totally their man. If he is actually given the power to control Chechnya, he is given the money to control Chechnya. It is I would say the world experience of using the local rebels, of giving them the power, putting them in the power. How it works, it's definitely better than it was after the war. He's definitely building, trying to employ the people, trying to
Sorry, go on.
To create something for the young generation, so that they are busy and stay there and give them an education.
Sorry to interrupt. My question is, I know he's loyal to the Kremlin, but is he running the show, or is he being told what to do? Is he being micromanaged?
I think he's not micromanaged. He's probably
Masha?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that in the lots of information that we received during these first days before Dr. Umarov, the head of Caucasus Emirate, took responsibility upon himself, that Dr. Vaha Abdurrahmanov, the Speaker of Kadyrov Parliament, said that Chechens could not have done that, and this must have been Russian special services who did it. That was said by the Speaker of Kadyrov's parliament. That's so much as to how much understanding and control is there. But also, I think what is important to see whether there is war or there is stability and prosperity in this region. Because, I don't know, over 2 weeks ago we were still saying that in Chechnya, Kadyrov has achieved fantastic results, everybody's happy and it's the safest place on earth. Today, we are hearing, like what Oksana said, that of course in the south of the Caucasus we have the war going on. So that's something that the Russian official bodies have to decide what's happening.
Essentially, Moscow has a five-fold strategy, if you can call it that, towards the North Caucasus. The first thing is throw resources, human and financial, at the problem. The second is conduct search and destroy operations, clearly. Third is what they call Chechenization. You co-opt the local elites because they have the best intelligence and they're able to implement policies much better than, say, through federal organs. And the fourth is kind of quid pro quo. The third is devolution of a certain amount of decision-making powers. And essentially what happens here is Moscow and Kadyrov work on a kind of quasi-feudal basis, king and barons. So Moscow, or Putin, for example, is king. Kadyrov is a powerful baron. And essentially the king says to the baron, you fix a problem, you make sure the conflict is localized, and you make sure that you pay formal allegiance to Moscow's authority and Russian sovereignty. But essentially, within those broad, generous parameters, we don't care what you do, provided, and this is the fifth part of it, you can quarantine the conflict from coming to Moscow, and from hitting Russia. And so that really is, I think, Moscow's approach, strategic, if you like, approach to the region.
And what's your answer to this question that everyone's in the room for? You're talking very specifically about people who run Chechnya and people who don't, but where the war on terror is concerned, do the attacks in Moscow, by blowing up people, blowing up people on the subway, do they give us common cause in terms of policy, or are they the only thing is the weapon? Are they the same or different? You?
Different enemies, so therefore not common cause in that sense, but possibly common cause in terms of how you deal with a terrorist or partisan guerrilla threat. And in that sense, the answer there is really interesting because, of course, if the Kremlin doesn't actually have this close control over Kadyrov and the others, then actually the policy that it uses is not its choice.
Yes, of course, and we'll pass the microphone to you and you go on.
Okay, I mean, first of all, we have to emphasize that this time around, the terrorism is not coming from Chechnya. It's from Dagestan. And if we look at the situation in Dagestan, it's completely different from the situation in Chechnya. Yes, in Chechnya we had a war, it's a different kind of environment. The problem now, and I think Masha actually mentioned, and I totally agree, we have a shift of paradigm in the North Caucasus. We used to have a nationalist struggle in Chechnya. And the Baron King model is exactly right to deal with nationalism. But now we have all across the North Caucasus, the jihadi groups that have grown from the bottom up, who don't seek secession. They don't want independent state. Nobody advocates independence of Dagestan. Nobody advocates independence of Ingushetia. They want to establish, the emirate, what they say emirate, but what they really want, they don't want the authorities, the regional authorities, to have any power over the situation. They are against the state, period. And nobody can understand how these groups operate. I talked a lot with the regional officials. They're completely clueless. Who are those young people? From Dagestan, from Ingushetia, from Kabardino-Balkaria, not from Chechnya, from all across the North Caucasus. And they are very young, most of them in their 20s or even teens, like this one of the suicide bombers, who just come there to fight the state, but not for the cause of nationalism or separatism, but just to fight the state because they think the state is evil, it's not religious enough, etc. And they're radicalized not only by the nationalist struggle. They go on the internet, they use the same jihadi networks which the people here are using. They are radicalized by what's happening in Afghanistan, they are radicalized by what is happening in Iraq, they are radicalized of what is happening all across the world with the Islamic community. That's how they're radicalized. And I think in that we have a common cause.
So these people, they are motivated by religious extremism.
Absolutely.
The same religious extremists and the same websites, you're saying.
Totally. And the other way around, people here in this country are radicalized by seeing brutality against Muslims in Chechnya, in Dagestan, and in Ingushetia. They also radicalized seeing all this, unfair treatment, brutality, killings, they're also radicalized. So it's the vicious circle, but we are all in this together.
I think there's only part of truth in it. I mean, we're all in this together, and we can say that terrorism is our common enemy, just as we can say the nuclear bomb is our common common enemy, obviously. And the methods we'll be thinking about it.
Right.
But it depends whose hands the bomb or terror is in. And it's not just by itself that this this radical Islamism is spreading. I interviewed Natalia Estemirova, the human rights activist who was murdered in summer of 2009. And she told me, she was half Chechen herself and she grew up there. She said it's completely contrary to the Chechen culture that a young man who might be his mother's own breadwinner to go to the mountains and just leave his family. It's completely contrary to the culture that still is very, very vivid there. Why does he do that? There was unemployment. Irina said that Kadyrov was trying to do it, but there obviously were still problems. And they were by the brutality and the difficult social circumstances made these people go to the mountains to join the other.
David Lawley, freelancer. I just think that in the North Caucasus is clearly a domestic situation, whereas the Western war for oil against Al-Qaeda, which is in Afghanistan, is clearly a completely different war. The fact that they both use the same similar terrorist suicide bombers out of desperation and financial circumstance is a coincidence. And I think for Obama to say that he stands hand in hand with Putin is a very irresponsible comment, because it just creates amongst the middle classes of America the thinking that it's just Muslims throughout the world who are the problem. And I think that irresponsibility, he is asking for, therefore, for Putin to one day come behind Obama when he decides to hit Iran.
Right, but you're saying it is motivated by extremism, religious extremism.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the Muslims that are the problem. It's the problem of the governments all across the world who are not able to deal and integrate in their society. You know, the groups that, you know, want to seek their own you know, vision, you know, their own interests. But I'm not saying it's the Muslims who are the problems. I'm just saying that the roots of the problem now are very, very similar. It's not about separatism. It's not about independent struggle. It's about, you know, joining the global, you know, trends that are all over the world. And if you talk to those young people in North Caucasus, believe me, they read exactly the same websites as the, you know, radicals here read. Believe me.
Well, then you are telling us it's the similar religious extremism.
Yes.
Well, but I just want to nail it down. I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be chairing the discussion. He's asking you, we're all here about this question, which unites all of our countries or not. Is there a religious... And is it the same religious root?
No, in each country it's different. In Pakistan it's different from Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is different from Iraq, and Iraq is different from the UK.
Okay.
In US, but the problems are very similar, of course.
I don't see the problems as being very similar, because, I mean, what's similar about the state of Muslims, say, in the UK or in France or in the United States to the case of Muslims in North Caucasus? They have a completely... Of course, some of them take inspiration from sort of jihad, Wahhabi philosophy, theology. Yes, that is true. But I would argue that they are a small minority. That fundamentally what you have is this huge reservoir of popular resentment and also a sense of despair, because you're thinking, there's nothing here for me, because I can't get a job. And if I'm a sort of a male 16 to 30 and I'm not up in the mountains and I'm not with the militia, I'm going to get killed.
Irina?
So what are you going to do?
Irina?
You know, I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying it is a sort of a desperation element compared that differs fundamentally from Muslims in the West.
Let me try to put it this way. The roots of this desperation can be different. But the results and how it now works is very, very, very similar. I mean, obviously, North Caucasus is probably our Russian North Island, which you had here. And in this looking like this, it's a domestic issue. But now, Oksana is absolutely right. These young people who are desperate for different reasons. Some of them do not have jobs, some of them are not get in the positions they want. Some of them can't find their way in the life. Can be very, very different. Some of them are not happy with the community where they live and the rules of this community, and they want to be, I don't know, more Western rather than live in their community. They all go to the same websites, and they all actually to the same social networks.
But then, Irina, to solve these problems, you should solve these problems. It's not fighting the ways, the websites they're reading. It's the problems that are in the root of
Nobody's fighting with the websites. It is very difficult, I would say.
But how do you identify the problems then?
And the wealthy, and
the
wealthy and democratic, and very, very proud of itself, with a very good history, Britain. Spend a lot of time on resolving this problem. It is really a very, very difficult problem,
yes.
and it will take time.
Everyone will agree with you about that, but we want to leave the room with an answer from you all to this question, because many people here, we're all caught up in it now. To the back there.
Yes, thank you. I've been living on the edge of the Caucasus for the last 17 years. And whilst there is a general religious revival going on, it's not necessarily just Islam, but there are all sorts of religions that are very active in that part of the world. But I mean, obviously all acts of terrorism have some sort of analogies, but I don't see that terrorism in the North Caucasus and from the North Caucasus into other parts of Russia has really much to do with terrorism elsewhere.
So do you think this, the second part of the question, the West and Russia are now on the same side over the war?
I don't think they are at all. I mean, there's a clear reason why Moscow's metro was bombed, and that is that there's nothing being done about what's going on really in the North Caucasus. Yes, Kadyrov may have built more roads and more houses, but the same brutality is going on there as has always been going on there. And it's just a symbol of what has been happening in Russia over the last 15 years or so. I mean, the killing of Anna Politkovskaya, Alexander Litvinenko, the cavalier way in which he was killed. I mean, all these things have an association. And
I was only stepping on your toes to ask you, of the comments we've heard tonight, who do you most side with, who do you most disagree with, and then when you pass the microphone to the end of your line?
I would probably side with the two people in the middle. Yes.
Bobo? Yes, and Masha? And who do you most disagree with?
Marina and Oksana.
Now I'm going to blow myself.
Right, so there is a division. We all get the division now. And to the end here, on the end, there's a point of similarity, which we're going to close in a few minutes because we're moving on to another part of the discussion, in fact. But some people are saying it's a different cause, but the effects are the same. Civilians in a train, TV pictures of people with bandages. So that's something to discuss before we all leave. But to you, anyway.
Thank you. My name is James Nixia. I work for Chatham House. To Oksana in particular, actually, evening Oksana, I wanted to, you mentioned Beslan and you mentioned radicalization. And so with that in mind, it seems to me Umarov actually criticized Basayev's tactics in Beslan. And now he's committed an atrocity which is along the same lines. So as far as I can see from your reasoning, something must have happened to him in the interim. So, but I haven't understood from your thesis exactly what it was in between those 6 years or so that happened to him in order to radicalize him like that from your thesis.
And can I just interrupt you? Can you explain who the people are you're talking about?
Sorry, Umarov is
head of the resistance.
Who is generally thought to be responsible and has claimed responsibility on YouTube, where it was taken off for this attack. And Basayev is his predecessor in some ways, who was killed by Russians.
Well, I mean, I think if we actually read, I think the websites of the resistance, of the Umarov, of this fighters, you actually can see the transition which happened. If you just look through the archives, the last 5 years, it started from supporting the nationalist struggle, the problems of the people in North Caucasus, and it's moved very much to being part of the global jihad, to being anti-Israel, to being anti, anti-Western, to criticizing what's happening in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I think this is more and more and more, they are part of this. And at the same time, I think we do not know what motivated Umarov to do that now. We don't know. There are a lot of speculations that are going on, why it happened. it might very well be not at all related to what's happening now in the North Caucasus. It might very well be related to, various theories with the appointment by Moscow recently of the new, regional Tsar, so to speak, Laponian, to administer, so the local elites in the North Caucasus could conspire. But it's just a different issue. But I think clearly the use of suicide bombers, indiscriminately in the metro is a tactic which is not indigenous to the North Caucasus.
Okay,
this is not something which is.
Is that an answer? Is that an answer? Did you hear an answer? I think he was asking you, why has there been a change? Have you had an answer?
Yeah.
Oh, well, what is the answer? Why has there been a change?
I don't agree with it. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I still think that we're missing something for somebody to have been radicalized
this is the answer. We don't
as
know
they did.
what's...
But of course, Oksana has given us her opinion.
No, but it's a public meeting. We want yours. Get to answer your own questions.
I think it seems clear. Well, in the specific case of for what it's worth, I don't think my opinion is very relevant, but of Umarov, then I understand that his family were physically abused and tortured by the Russian forces, and that may have had something to do with his particular radicalization. And that also seems to be the case of Basayev's family, who were also killed by the Russian forces. So it does seem to me that you can possibly, and we're only speculating, and Oksana said we don't exactly know about motivations, so none of us really know motivations, but the Russian action of the Russian armed forces must have had something to do with their radicalization over the years.
Well, thank you for your own opinion, which I think I saw a lot of people nodding at it. So, and to you, you've been waiting.
Thank you. To state my opinion first,
Would you use
Russia?
Would you use
I think Russia and the West are on the same team. I think radical Islam is the enemy, but I think for a slightly different reason, and that is that there's lots of poverty all over the world. Okay, there's lots of regions with much higher unemployment than the regions we're talking about. The similarities. Suicide bombing as a tactic is usually in response to some form of occupation. It's very rare historically that you have suicide bombers without occupying forces. And whether that's in Sri Lanka, India, China, various parts of the Middle East, against the US, here, that drive, in my opinion, is really a response to occupation. And so I think the similarity is that, and I think the response is similar, and I think the enemy is similar.
Okay, and could I ask you, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your own background, or not?
My name is Mark.
Mark, okay. Okay, no, we're all in this together in the room. But Mark, could I ask you then, because we're closing this part of the discussion, would you like to single out a remark on the panel which has given this, your view, added impetus, or to someone who you don't agree with? Because we're coming to the close, we must ask our panel to wrap up.
Yeah, I sort of see the world the same way as
Oksana on the
Oksana,
end.
yeah.
Okay, so in that case, we're going to move on to a rather more general discussion on the war on terror, which you've all come to, and there's more panelists waiting. But you've been very kind to take part in this. Would you kindly give us some closing thoughts, and we'll move on after this. The question that we all came for was, the war on terror, are Russia and the West now on the same side? Would you please go in reverse order as we began and answer that question and wrap up?
Well, I think we are on the same side, and I think we are on the same side, even though I totally accept that the causes could be different. But we are on the same side because we have to adjust to new realities of the world, much more globalized, how the technology is impacting the disenfranchised societies, and how those disenfranchised parts of the society can now resort to this, mass destruction directed against civilians. And I think we need to all think very hard what the solutions are. And I think there's no clear solutions on the surface. I agree totally. None of the North Caucasus regions are the poorest regions of Russia. If you look on the map, none of them are the poorest. And the corruption is very rampant in many other parts of the world. We need to find other ways how to integrate people in societies. And also in this country, how do we integrate the Muslim community more in the mainstream of British politics, of British life? How do you make them part of the society? In Russia, those women who blow themselves up on the train were people who were isolated, disenfranchised, people who were radicalized through the internet, people who had grievances, and nobody was there to listen to them.
Masha Karp.
When in 2002 there was a terrorist attack in the Moscow theater on Dubrovka, and Russian authorities gassed more than 170 people there, just trying to save them, obviously. Bush and Blair both said what a wonderfully conducted operation Putin has done. Now, I just wonder, because now many in Russia think that the consequences of this terrorist attacks would be still more pressure on human rights, still more, still worse record of the authorities against the human rights activists. I just wonder whether the West will applaud to the Russian authorities.
Dr. Bobo Lo?
I want to make 2 points. Moscow wants to internationalize the problem, terrorism. It does not want to internationalize the solution. It wants the West's unconditional moral and political support, but it does not want the West's active policy involvement in trying to address some of the problems. Now, ask yourself, if we have improved counterterrorism cooperation between Russia and the West, you know, we now have an improved relationship between Moscow and Washington, so you think that there's going to be some progress in counterterrorism. My problem is this: you're attacking the symptom, not the roots of the problem. You have to address the causes. If you just improve the quality of, say, intelligence sharing between Russia and the West, you are not going to address the fundamental problems. And it isn't just corruption or unemployment, it's brutality, it's the whole package of disasters. And I'm afraid until, and it's going to be a very long, protracted process, until you address those root causes, you are not going to sort out the problem of terrorism in the North Caucasus, no matter how good your counterterrorism cooperation is with the West.
Final word to you, Irina Demchenko.
I would say that, in my understanding, the problems are very similar. When the civilian people are suffering the bomb explosions on their way to work, or I don't know, or the school children suffering their hostage, it's exactly the same problems around the world, and it should be addressed by all the governments. I was very sad when, after the Litvinenko's death, the British government involved a lot of actions against the Russian government. Involving one of them was this battle against the terrorism. I think this one was very, very wrong. I think this one, I think we should move forward together with this.
Right. Thank you all very much for talking specifically about this dreadful incident in Moscow. And we know with your expertise you could have gone on for longer, but you've teed us up perfectly for the second half of our discussion. So thank you, Irina Demchenko, Dr. Bobo Lo, Masha Karp, and Osanka Antonienko. Thank you very much. Right, over to you. Come on. Okay, yes? Can you just say it quickly? Okay. So, well, if I could ask Irina, if you could kindly unplug yourself before you get off, otherwise it'll be a disaster. Thank you. Everyone? Okay. Asim Qureshi is coming up. All right. Please, you can stay at the end there by all means. Keep the microphones on. Sit in the audience, yes, just for now. We try and keep the momentum. Masha, do stay in the front so we know where you are. Just sit there, Bobo, that's fine. There's not enough chairs. Put your microphone on in case you want to talk. Irina, do catch my eye if you want to keep going. We just want to draw a distinction. So for the second part of the evening, we wanted to discuss specifically the war on terror and whatever it means. And can it ever be successful in combating terrorism? And I think many people made similarities, and in the audience there was some agreement about this. So welcome to the stage, Asim Qureshi. Would you kindly introduce yourself, Asim?
I've got a background in law. I did my master's specialising in international law, international human rights law. And for the last 7 years, I've been researching and investigating abuses within the context of the war on terror, predominantly detentions, but in some cases extrajudicial killings as well. But really, as part of my work with the NGO Caged Prisoners, I've been trying to record the kinds of abuses that have been taking place.
And you've just been listening to the discussion as we have all. Can you give us some themes that you heard that you both strongly agreed with and strongly disagreed with, so we all know in the audience whether to like you or dislike you.
I think if you ask my wife, everybody would dislike me anyway. But the point is that nothing exists in a vacuum. And what I was getting is from some of the panelists is a feeling that somehow just by looking at a website, you would somehow become radicalized without really taking into account the things that really matter to a lot of the people. A lot of the people that I interview, and I've met a lot of Chechens and a few people from Ingushtia as well, and I've spoken to them about their experiences. And what's interesting for me is that when people are talking about how all of these are, different acts of suicide terrorism around the world are comparable to one another, they fail to take into account, sorry, I'm getting too excited there. They fail to take into account the divergence between the different peoples. For example, can you honestly say that a socialist in Palestine who chooses to do a suicide bombing is the same as a Sufi in Chechnya who decides to do a suicide bombing? Not all of them come from the Wahhabi doctrine. Not all of them come from the same kind of Salafi background. In fact, most of the Chechens I know are Sufis. So when you speak to them, when you ask them about what they're going through, it's not necessarily the same thing every time.
And to you in just a second in the audience, there was a question of religion raised, and the panel was agreeing or not on the question of, okay, is there a religious element, and that religion is a form of extremism linked to Islam? Is there?
In some cases, yes. I mean, we've seen it before, and there's no denying that. I think definitely the London bombings was very much linked to religion, because those people would not have carried out what they did without feeling as if they had some kind of religious authority to do so. Nobody's going to take their own life unless they feel they're going to go to heaven for doing it.
And was there a link made by the panelists for you that this is a religious, or is it a nationalistic, family-orientated dispute?
Well, I mean, this is the thing. I think you have to look at every single circumstance and every single incident in and of itself. You can't say that because there's radical Islam or because there's jihadis all over the world that this incident must be linked to that. No, that's a very, very naive and actually baseless position to take.
Okay, so does anyone want to join in now from the audience? Yes, to Mark again, the man of mystery.
No, no, not really. I just have one question. Can you illuminate an example where these types of suicide bombings are happening and there's no occupying force? The religious argument aside.
Well, this is actually the point that I'm trying to make, and I should have clarified further that, because nothing exists in a vacuum, you have to look at then all of those other factors. So when you look at, say, the use of the Kontrakt-Niki within Chechnya, the kind of abuses that were taking place by them to the Chechen people every day, why is it that people, they were essentially criminals who were drafted to do law enforcement exercises within the Caucasus and ended up actually abusing the local population to a great extent. And this was used on a widespread scale within the Caucasus. So when you look at actions like that, then you start and you look at the patterns of behavior where people who were one time very open to dialogue then turned and said, well, that's it, we've had enough. Now, Chechnya, the Caucasus really, it's completely different from anything else. What we're talking about here is a 500-year history of trying to struggle against what many of them perceive as colonial domination, okay, or occupation. It's not something that's been going on for less than 100 years like in Palestine. This is a much longer history going all the way back.
The 19th century.
Sorry? No. Even further than that. Okay, if you want to take it, say, at its most prominent point, then yeah, okay, fine. I would say the late 1700s with Sheikh Mansour, and then later on with Imam Shamil as well. So you're going back, much further than most other places. And this has not just been, okay, they thought that they fought at that time and that was the end of it, and then there was another period in history later on. No, it's been perpetual since that time up until now.
Now, if I can ask you all in the audience and on the panel, you can talk about this again up here. Is there still a war on terror? I can't remember if there was and then there wasn't. Maybe you can help in the audience. I know there was, and we were all in favour of it, and then there isn't quite such a war on terror now. What's your understanding, and what's your understanding in the room?
Well, actually, it's interesting that
I mean, I'm against terrorism. Yeah. Can I just make that plain myself? I mean, I'm an impartial chairman, but is there a war on terror or not? No.
Regardless of what you call it, there is. And for me, it's very, very important that the term war on terror is used because of its historical significance. I've seen a shift in language, but the language is only language. If the policies are exactly the same, then there can't be any shift, because what you're looking at is policies. You're not looking at how people are talking about a subject. So, you know, even if you say this is no longer the war on terror, but you're still sending drones in to kill people and you're still detaining people extrajudicially, then of course that's exactly the same thing, and it's still the same.
The problem I have twofold. Global war on terror, aka the GWOT, has become almost a sobriquet. Really, it's been a subject of mockery, and in Russia was the subject of growing cynicism, because Russians tended to see the Bush administration's allegiance to the global war on terror as basically a means to project American power and influence globally. Now, you can argue yes or no, but that certainly was a very, very strong perception, and particularly after Iraq. Part of the problem is that people do have very, very different values. We try and address, meet the challenges of terrorism on very, very different bases. We have fundamentally divergent values, I would argue, between Russia and the West, and China, and many of Pakistan or Sri Lanka. And so that's part of the problem. Global war on terror implies a kind of a united front that simply doesn't exist, and frankly cannot exist. So while we can agree that the consequences of terror are truly universal, there is a common language there, we cannot agree on causes and we cannot agree on methods.
And do we agree that it's effective, one way and another?
Well, the problem is it isn't effective because we start from such different perspectives.
Sorry, do we agree that terrorism remains effective? If you blow up 40 people in a metal train, does it get attention for your cause?
Yes, but it can be negative attention. I would actually see the Moscow bombing as actually a terrorism. I put that in the context of terrorism as last resort, in a sense that, you know, you are that desperate that you're going to go beyond a degree that frankly you would not have considered before, as Omar didn't consider it before, but now considers it acceptable.
Well, I think if we remember Beslan, you know, school siege, actually it was not effective, because after the Beslan school siege, the whole international community turned away from the Chechen cause, and turned away from what used to be at that time, you know, sort of a lot of support for the suffering, and they said this is simply not an acceptable methods, you know, to support any objectives you might have, even if they are legitimate. I think now in the Moscow metro, again, as I said, we don't know why it happened, you know, what objectives they have. Clearly, it is striking that, you know, those who claimed responsibility did not actually put any demands at all.
No, they just claimed responsibility.
So it's really claim responsibility to kill innocent people in this war. That's it.
That is a losing.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. I largely agree with Bobo, but I want to go back right to the very beginning, to the very use of the word terrorist in such a glib and broad way. I consider that bombing people from 10,000 feet and using helicopter gunships to destroy people is terrorism. And if you look at the number of people that have been killed in the so-called war on terror, it far outweighs the number of even these horrifying incidents that have been referred to here today. In fact, it was Paddy himself right at the very beginning said, everybody knows what terrorism is, and I'm challenging that very point.
Well, and would you like to answer your question again? Would you say that there is a war on terror, even though you don't like it? Has it united policies around the world which shouldn't be united?
No, I think that the various governments have their own agendas and their own situations, and they use violence in all sorts of different forms far too much, but that's a separate question.
And not to defend myself, Frank, because it's a fair point, but is blowing up 40 people on a metal train at Russia, is that terrorism?
It is terrorism, yes. But I'm saying it's not restricted, the term terrorism is not restricted to things of that kind.
I think one of the things that's very, very easy to do is when things like metro bombings happen, is to revert back to the basic position, which is we've got to defend ourselves and we've got to do whatever we can or whatever we need to in order to do that. And if you don't mind me giving a quick plug to my book, Rules of the Game, it literally charts, the purpose of the book was essentially to chart exactly what's happened over the last, well, since the war on terror started really, in different countries around the world, so showing that the detentions that were happening in Bosnia are no different than what were happening in the Horn of Africa recently, or what's been happening in Afghanistan or Pakistan. The kind of argumentation that is used, which is that we're under attack, so we need to do whatever we can to defend ourselves, is, you know, in many ways, the thing that we're now seeing in Russia as well. So when they say we need to just destroy these people, that same kind of naive response has been used in history as well, but the problem is that it's never worked to respond like that. And I think that's the thing that people need to see. So when you've got a globalized world where now people are finding out about little children like Hafsa Swaleh Ali, who I interviewed in Kenya. She was detained for 30 days without a mattress or a blanket in very, very cold conditions. And she was interrogated by the Kenyan anti-terrorist police unit about, you know, where her father was. This is a child, a 4-year-old child. So when people find out about these kinds of things, that kind of anger that is already there gets perpetuated, because then there is no more value for human life. And I agree that, you know, that there is, to some extent, because of the globalized world we live in, a kind of unified sense of victimization, but that's not necessarily religious. That could be from anything. I mean, look at the Tamil Tigers. They're not religious. Look at socialist Palestinians who commit suicide bombings. They're not religious. So the unifying point is not necessarily religion as much as it is grievance, and it's a politics of grievance that needs to be addressed, not as much terrorism in and of itself.
You said, I think, at the beginning that you thought there was still a war on terror. Do you think that's a good thing? Sorry, do you think that's a good thing that there's a war on terror?
No, I don't. No, sorry if I didn't make that clear.
When you, okay, and when you say there is a war on terror, the war on terror is defined by some of the things that you've just been describing there, I think, like illegal detention and I can't remember what the other list
was. I mean, generally, that kind of reactive counter-terrorism policies, which don't look to go beyond simply detaining people, killing them, effectively feeling as if somehow you can wipe out your enemy, you know, through various counter-terrorism policies. And it's that kind of approach which I find problematic, because it's never helped so far. And even in history, if you look at other countries, like the Irish Troubles, like apartheid, like so many other conflicts of the past, it's never ever helped.
But there are individual scenarios, shall we say, be it Afghanistan or be it Chechnya or whatever it is, that individually need addressing, presumably.
Sorry, I didn't...
well, what I'm trying to say is I suppose that there are people who are prepared to attack London, who are prepared to attack New York, who are prepared to attack Moscow. Yeah. Let's put it like that. So those individual organizations or those individual scenarios must be challenged, presumably, by Moscow or by London or by Washington.
And that's one of the things that, you know, I do try to say, that, in fact, we do need to deal with those things, but how, the question is, how do you deal with them?
Okay, just to answer your own questions, people who blow up British people who are born in Britain, would you like a war on them?
No, I think the war on terror is an absolute misnomer. I mean, I thought that had been generally established several years ago.
What would you like on those people? Would you like action against them? Would you like internment of them? What would you like? How do you know who they are?
I suppose my view is that people who are caught people should be dealt with through court systems. People should be dealt with as criminals, I think, in my view. That's why, I mean, I think that's how Guantanamo should be dealt with as well. People should be charged, taken to court, found guilty or innocent.
Well, you can't, because watching millions around the world can't hear you. So, no, there are millions. And we're going to run the event to time. So if you've got things, if you think we've lost the
It's
point,
just that
we've got 20 minutes to bring
I
it
think
back.
that the war on terror, wasn't that just a thing that Bush was the first person to use after 9/11? And the fact of calling it terror...
Well, what do you want a war on terror?
No, absolutely not. And I think that even though the gentleman is right...
Trains into the Twin Towers, what do you want done with the people who backed
As the gentleman said, I think that they should be put in court. And I also agree with the gentleman over there that if a cruise missile came through that wall right now, we'd all be pretty terrorised and we'd be shitting ourselves. And therefore, therefore, using the phrase "war on terror" is the thing that is wrong in the first place. And that's the thing. It's the politics of fear that I believe Obama is trying not to use anymore.
You see, I mean, for me, the phrase war on terror has become nominal, okay, and that's how I view it, that you have to keep a historical record of what this thing is and what it became and what it did, because as soon as you allow them to change the language, somehow they separate themselves from everything that they did before. So Obama will be able to say that that was the war on terror under Bush, what I'm doing now is something completely different. No, if you don't change your policies, it's the same policy, which means it's the same thing. And that's why, for me at least anyway, in my opinion, it's very, very important that we use that term nominally, and that's why whenever I write, it's a capital W and it's a capital T.
Yeah.
Because
isn't that
people need
feeding
to
them?
remember historically what happened to the victims on both sides, you know, and I accept that there are victims on both sides, but what happened to the victims, and you know, what the responses were, and then how do you learn from those?
And just while we're swapping the microphone over, we will end in about 15 minutes. If any of you feel the essential questions not being answered, please call everyone to account.
I'm no supporter of the this notion of the war on terror, but with the
Would
panel...
you like to introduce yourself a bit?
Brian Saker, just a member of the public.
Hooray, we like members of the public, it's fun.
But is it not fair to say that there are people, some of whom in Guantanamo Bay and elsewhere, who are, in a sense, conducting a war, are conducting a war and can't really be dealt with purely through the criminal process because A, there's not enough evidence to stand up in a court of law, and B, they remain a risk to the West or whoever, so long as this kind of struggle in their own minds at least goes on.
I emphatically disagree with that. I mean, I think this country at least used to have a very, very good criminal justice system, which was able to find criminals, to use the intelligence correctly, and to actually prosecute them of the crimes they commit. For example, when you look at the kind of terrorism that's taking place by white nationalists, they are not put under terrorism legislation. They are convicted under firearms acts and various other pieces of legislation, and they're found with plans, with bombs and equipment and everything else. Okay, so when you've got the evidence that you're actually able to convict these people, then the same should be applied to Muslims as well. And that kind of separation of the way these people are dealt with in itself is very problematic.
Now, I think we did hear the panel say there'd been an internationalization, and I think, to be fair, would you like to take issue with this? Because if there's no international jurisdiction, well, if there's no national jurisdiction, right, how are these people going to be brought to justice?
Yes, I mean, if they didn't commit a crime in Britain or in the US, and also, there may not be the sort of evidence that can be gathered because they were picked up in, I guess, what could be described as suspicious circumstances somewhere overseas, but there's no one who's going to be able to testify against them.
And are you glad that there's a fight against terror? You maybe don't like it. You said you like the war on terror. Are you pleased?
No, I don't support the Bush kind of concept of it all, but I do believe that there are combatants of a sort, just like, in any war, there are people who have to be kept in internment because they're on the other side.
Sorry. And are they predominantly religious terrorists, or are they nationalists? And has the panel tonight made a good enough distinction for you about how to tell your religious terrorist from your nationalist terrorist, and then your freedom fighter? Has that all been brought out for you tonight?
It's been very illuminating. I wouldn't claim myself to be an expert to rule on who's a nationalist and who's a
and finally,
religious.
We are interested in your views. Have you been terrorised? Were you caught up in London? Do you feel when people shopping in Westfield are terrorised? People who on Oxford Street, do they look terrorised to you at the moment?
No, I think there's a sort of 2 week or 2 month period after an attack when people feel vulnerable and then they get on with their lives in general.
To you in the back, sorry, the lady just with the checkered shirt on.
Rachel Quillen, also a member of the public. I just want to say it's interesting that it's got to this point, because one of the crucial things about the war on terror, and I think it should only ever be mentioned in inverted commas, is how far is state policy going to go to deal with it? And exactly, the gentleman was saying, how can people be brought to justice? And they should be brought to justice through the criminal justice system. And the point about the war on terror is that that states are willing to suspend the rule of law in order to deal with these people. And when that happens, the justification for a war on terror or anything, this kind of policy, whatever you want to call it, is completely in question, because then you're suspending everything that we're supposedly defending against these people and what they're doing.
But what would you do with them?
I think they have to be brought to justice, like all criminals are suspected criminals are brought to justice.
So the teenage girl who blows herself up in Moscow, it's too late to do anything with her, but she's done quite a lot to the other people around her, hasn't she? So what do you do?
I think I think that the approach is twofold. One is, obviously, you have to try and catch the perpetrators. That's the case in any crime. And at the same time, you have to do what has been mentioned all evening by Bobo Lo and others, is to address the causes of it.
I think, and I agree with that, I think the why of political violence is the most important thing. Once you establish why things happen and why people do what they do, you are on the first stages of actually trying to help resolve the grievances that they have. But right now what's happened is that there is, maybe a purposeful naivety in terms of how to respond to these people.
Yeah. Well, I think, we tend to paint everything either with, white brush or black brush. Of course, war on terror is perpetrated by Bush, particularly using Iraq as an example of the war on terror, is, complete nonsense and totally counterproductive. But I think we also have to admit that although it is not about military means, but it also cannot be done without, military means. Look at what is happening now in Pakistan. Of course, we can just say that, well, let all these, regions along the border with Afghanistan continue to exist as a safe haven for all sorts of people who establish their networks there. Of course, we need to support the fact that the Pakistani government is trying to do something to crack down on those networks that actually then reach out to the rest of the world. But of course, we are also concerned as a good citizens of the West of how do they do it? Do they violate the human rights? We want them to crack down on those people, but also do it in a way which doesn't violate their rights and doesn't then produce more terrorism. We're kind of locked into this, into this circle where, on one hand, we want to encourage them to fight terrorism because we all are afraid here, because this is where the terrorism, originates from. But we don't want, we don't want to take responsibility for what is going on there.
But you're yourself recognizing that, that military response is in fact the counterproductive response in the end. Because
but we don't know any other response.
For example, if you watch some of the videos of Ayman al-Zawahiri, okay, he quotes things like the debate regarding the 28 days detention without charge. He quotes about counterterrorism policies that are going on in the Western world, and then uses those very points to say that look at the West concept of democracy and how far they have fallen, and that's not really actually worth anything.
So you are suggesting that we should actually, do a deal with Ayman Zawahiri, yeah?
No,
that we actually should listen very carefully what he's saying and take it into account in our own practices of democracy here.
Well,
I mean, this is a joke. This is a person who has actually been plotting, to kill innocent people all around the world. I mean, I think there are, of course, genuinely legitimate causes, and we talk about, nationalist struggle. We're talking about, various, campaigns that are happening and violation of human rights. But there are, of course, instances in which we do not negotiate with people who actually, in some cases, which perpetrate violence against civilians on a massive scale.
But everything that has been done so far has only proven that violence doesn't work. And the best example is that of the Brighton conference bombing. The year after that bombing took place, they signed the Anglo-Irish Agreement. I mean, this in itself, for me, is one of the best examples of how a government recognized that everything we have done up to a point has completely failed. And it took some of the cabinet to be killed, for the Prime Minister herself to almost be killed, for them to actually realize that, okay, hold on, everything we've done so far hasn't worked. We need to think a completely different strategy. And that's when they decided that, okay, negotiation is our only way forward. And that has to be the response. First dialogue, and from there, there's a hope for negotiation, and then from there, at least the ability to bring some kind of stability, because so far, the more people you kill, it perpetuates in a cycle, they kill more people back. That's how it works. It's that simple. The logic is not difficult to follow.
Look, I think in any struggle against terrorism or the manifestations of terrorism, we have to understand that there's no simple, clear strategy that one can adopt. Life isn't like that. It really isn't. I think any successful counterterrorism strategy has to do two things. One, it has to think in the long term, accepting that solutions and approaches will take a long time to achieve positive results, if they even achieve positive results. And the second thing is any successful counterterrorism strategy has to be multifaceted. And I actually do agree with Oksana on this. I do think there has to be, if you like, a hard power element. There has to be a military or policing element. But that cannot work unless there is socio-economic and a political solution as well. It has to be multifaceted. That's the only way it's going to ever work.
Time is tight. I'm coming to you in a second. But does that mean, under your own analysis, the bombing of Afghanistan in the end of 2001 was done because the Taliban sheltered Osama and the people behind 9/11? That's the version. Do you support the bombing of Afghanistan because the Taliban wouldn't give him up? That was a very short-term aim. Thank you very much for holding him. Give him up or we'll bomb you. Do you support that?
Yes, I did.
To you.
My name is Jessie Kainer. I do work for the BBC, but I'm here as a... my name is Jessie Kainer. I work for BBC, but I'm here in a personal capacity.
Welcome.
I just wanted to come back to the question of how much do we really want to think about terrorism or the causes of terrorism, particularly in the cases of the incidents in the Russian Federation, when on occasion after occasion it seems to be that the cases haven't properly been investigated. There hasn't been a thorough investigation of Beslan. Some reports even suggested that a lot of the people who took part in the siege actually escaped when the siege was going on. That there are disputes about how many people there were. We call them terrorists. Some of them apparently were hostages. In this case of the bombing in Moscow just recently, after the incident, the station was cleared up incredibly quickly, and they wanted to get the trains running again. I mean, surely that should have been maintained as an area to investigate, and not just.
But do you have those doubts about the attacks in the UK?
Less so, but I'm not sure about what goes on in other countries, and also, you know, we have all these questions have arisen about the use of torture in people who've been detained in Guantanamo and other places around Europe for the purposes of counter-terrorism.
And would you like to, there's 5 minutes left, would you like to be perhaps one of the first to give a closing remark? You came because of the title tonight. What is something you've heard that is new to you that you found gave you great interest, and what is something that you vehemently disagree with about the question, the war on terror, are Russia and the West now on the same side, and can the war on terror be successful in combating terrorism?
It's been a really interesting evening, but I can't agree that we're all on the same side. That seems to me absolutely clear. And I was very interested to hear about how many other religions there are in the region of Chechnya. I didn't know that. I just think that it's a terrible mask of all the problems that there are around the world if we say there's just them and us. And I don't think that saying that suggests to me that there's any desire to really solve the problems that we're facing. And in many ways, I even feel maybe I'm going to be called a terrorist too at some point in the future if I don't like what my government's doing in Afghanistan, or I don't know, it makes me feel very uneasy.
So let's have some closing comments, including from you, if we would. We'll end in 5 minutes. One of the things that's been diced around, I think, is this question of them and us. Are we really saying it's come down to Muslim extremists and everyone else? Is that how the argument's being portrayed? And that if everything that happens can be either rightly or wrongly bolted onto some young man or woman with a Muslim extremism. Is that how it seems to you the argument's going around the whole globe at the moment?
It feels like that for a lot of Muslims, and coming from the community itself, I feel myself that sometimes, we joke, we have all these jokes that we have between ourselves that, oh, you said that, you're such an extremist, you're such a terrorist, or whatever, and we actually joke like that about one another. But even our parents, who are much more scared than we are in terms of political participation and to talk about these kinds of things, have kind of accepted that there is a certain kind of lens that's been placed upon us, and we can't really escape that. So I think that no matter where you are in the world, as a Muslim, you do feel that sense of, okay, yeah, we are being watched a little bit more carefully than others.
And has there been enough discussed within public opinion in Britain whenever these things happen? Has there been enough outrage by well-known Muslim commentators? Is that part of the solution?
I don't think Muslims could have done more than they already did to actually condemn things like 9/11, 7/7, Beslan, and whatever else. To the extent that sometimes it felt almost as if, we're going over the top in order to kind of say that, this isn't from Islam. I mean, Muslims have been living in peace with non-Muslims for, centuries. And, sometimes it did feel almost as if, okay, fine, we've apologized, or not apologized, but said that we don't agree with this thing, or condemned. But, that's it. But there's this constant pressure that, okay, what do you really believe in? Who are you supporting? And I think that's counterproductive.
And have you heard from the room, the many different faces? I mean, I don't know all the religions here, but there's been a large amount of views put that abuses against legal rights in the UK are not the way to go. Do you feel that you've been joined in a large group of people against cracking down on?
I've always felt that from the start of my work. In fact, sometimes I feel as if I get more support from the non-Muslim community than I do from the Muslim community. But that's part of the criminalization process, that sometimes, you have your own parents saying, don't get involved because they're going to be after you. And that's the difficult part, that you have a stronger voice within non-Muslims.
And just wrapping things up, 2 comments from the floor. You, yes, with a scarf, and then on the panel, and anyone else?
Yeah, I'd just like to, first of all, there's a panelist that was advertised missing from the panel, which you didn't
Rashad
mention.
Ali, yes.
Yeah, and I'll be perfectly honest, I was quite relieved, because I'm happy to have a spectrum like this, people who are entrenched in the field rather than career-minded people who don't really produce the kind of solutions and raise the kind of debate that we've had excellently tonight. I myself, actually, 8 years ago this week, was on the receiving end of the war of terror. That's how I like to look at it. It's the war of terror. I've been on the other side of the door. I've had it banged down. I've had a loved one taken away, incommunicado, held, tortured, and I've campaigned to have that person released. And I've suffered as a result of the war of terror. I have not strapped a bomb to myself. I have no intention of doing such a thing, no matter what the outcome of that person. Now, my opinion on this issue, as a freelance journalist who's also written a review of this book for the Frontline Club, is for the Frontline Club, so I can say that, is we need to engage. We need to engage with Muslims like myself, Asim, other people who have witnessed, have seen, have recorded, reported, and experienced this, but subscribe to an Islamic ideology that is vehemently against violence, but nevertheless have an Islamic solution to some of the problems that exist in their home countries. And that without that happening, without people understanding it deeper, we're never going to have a solution.
And can I ask, in the evening, did you hear things which were new to you, which perhaps advanced your understanding of the question, how it's being addressed in the UK? Did you find yourself challenged? Did you accept another point of view?
I've absorbed a lot of things. I've agreed with a lot. I've found some of the comments naive in some, in some respects, but I have absorbed a lot, and I will be thinking about everyone's contributions.
And does it strike you as an unusual discussion? Do you think that this is perhaps, for all its rights and wrongs, should be a bit more, there should be a more bare-knuckle discussion about religious differences, about terrorist...
Actually, no, I think it was balanced. I think all the elements that were involved in the events, in Moscow in particular, and other events around the world have been raised. There is a lot of issues to discuss. It's, I'm studying a postgraduate degree in conflict resolution for that reason. We need to look at all the problems. We need to look at all the roots before we can just hand out a solution. It's not going to happen overnight.
Okay, well then I think I will end it there because we promised with the first Wednesdays that we will begin on time and end on time, so that you as busy people can go to your empires. But I hope you felt that you had a time to contribute during the evening, and thank you very much to you, but also to Asim Qureshi, who's joined the panel most recently, and they were Osanko Antonienko, Masha Karp, Dr. Bobo Lo, and Irina Demchenko. Thank you very much. Well done.